No. One of the interesting things about the death penalty is that it focuses attention on everything that came before. So if you're fighting a death penalty case, perhaps in the appellate court somewhere, or you have a petition of clemency that you have to think about, apart from giving the story of the client and possibly the story of the crime, especially as you go through the appeal system, you need to look at what happened at the beginning. Who did the crime? Is there a confession? Was there torture? Have any witnesses been bribed, or have other people who should be co-accused paid any bribes? And you go through the whole system like that. I'm not talking about any one particular country. Every country has its own strengths and weaknesses in their justice systems. But the unusual thing about a death penalty case is it forces or shines the light on everything that happened up to the moment of being sentenced to death. And in different countries that can include matters like torture. For instance, in some countries in South Asia, including in India, there's been research to talk about prisoners being tortured at the arrest phase and getting confessions which are as a result of torture. But the issue comes up not at the early stages, perhaps in an early trial where maybe not enough work has been done because the lawyers are in a big rush or whatever. But once you're fighting to save someone from death row, those issues come up. There seems to be a phenomenon sweeping the world which is political, and the Germans call it a Zeitgeist. It's a spirit of the time, and what we're seeing from the election of people like, say, President Trump, through to issues of Brexit, through to in quite a few countries a resurgence of populist politics and aggressive politics. That's the Zeitgeist. It ranges from Turkey to the Philippines to some countries in Eastern Europe. Sometimes, there are political incidents even in India that get caught up in this discussion. Now, in that phenomenon, which is real, it's happening. It's a new phenomenon, and it's linked to the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Berlin Wall, and it's linked to the development of globalization and the distribution of wealth across many nations. These are all tied together. In that giant phenomenon, one of the things that's happening is a growing contempt and a growing disregard for what has been a critical part of the world community in the last 70 or 80 years, which is human rights. And what the world learned during the Second World War was that we must never continue that kind of terrible violence that led to things like the concentration camps. Out of that comes the United Nations, Universal Declaration for Human Rights, and then 50 years of progress in rights concerning children, women, employment, artistic rights, rights of prisoners, human rights, international covenants about rights. Now that's a giant movement which has basically been moving forward since 1945. In the last 10 to 20 years, there's been a resistance in some circles to that progress. And so we have countries now who once abolished the death penalty talking about reintroducing the death penalty. We had countries that almost never executed talking about doing more executions, passing new laws for more executions to be on, more death penalties to be on the books. So yes, there's no doubt that there's an increased harshness in the air if you look at it globally. And in different parts of the world that's been successfully fought. In other parts of the world, the harshness is taking over, and there's an increasing desire for kind of a bit of a mob response, more brutality, more killings. So that makes the struggle for human rights, including the death penalty issue, an important and essential struggle of this period. When we're talking about 2019, but the next decade, we have to go forwards, not backwards. And unless a lot of people understand that look at it from an historical perspective and the need to teach about past struggles, understand what they were, and fight for the rights which are on a knife edge now, we're going to go backwards. We go backwards or forwards. Well, there's clearly a legitimate alternative to the death penalty. For instance, the Latin expression res ipsa loquitur, it speaks for itself, because since 1945, we now have a situation where most countries in the world who used to execute have stopped executing. Now there's only about 24 countries which execute. Last year, 23. The year before, 23 countries executed. There's over 190 countries in the world. So even though your question is a natural question from a country where people execute, to the rest of the world, it's a question which doesn't make sense. Of course there's an alternative to execution, because that's what most of us do. So the countries that don't execute are so many compared to the countries that do. It's self-evident, actually. Then the question is, well, what should the alternative be? And that's a question which varies enormously. So there are many countries which do not have life imprisonment without parole. And so it's perfectly legitimate, and in fact, I think essential, to argue for alternatives which are more understanding of human nature than a blanket life without parole. Life without parole is common in America. There's at least 50,000 people in prison who have no chance of parole in America. But some of them are there for 3 strikes and you're out rules, stealing a video or a chocolate 3 times when they were 19, and they're in jail for life without parole. It makes no sense at all. It's a very cruel system, life without parole. It's really the death penalty done slowly instead of the death penalty done quickly. So in order to respect the dignity of each person, to respect the justice system, to understand the importance for the individual and for society of the reformation of a prisoner, or hope, no matter how heinous the crime, we need to have sentences which are graded according to the severity of the crime, punishments which are related to the future risk to society and so on, which means that we should be always thinking about getting a prisoner out of jail as a reformed person after they've paid the debt to society. There'll be very few prisoners who should never be released, and usually that were related to mental conditions where it's so obvious because of they just can't stop being terribly violent or whatever it might be. I'm going to answer first with a story. Some of my clients who were executed, there were 2 Australians executed in Indonesia in 2015. I met them in 2006 and they had already been sentenced to death. Over the next few years, they gradually reformed themselves. They gradually admitted what they'd done, how wrong they had been. And then in the last 5 years of their life, as reformed prisoners, they had a tremendous influence on all the other prisoners, many of the other prisoners in that prison. Their lives became crowded with education, with teaching other people, with counselling, drug counselling, teaching English, teaching art, all that kind of thing. And that happened partly because the prison in Bali in Indonesia had a very generous and relaxed approach. So long as the prisoners behaved, they had freedom to do all kinds of things. So I'm one of the lucky lawyers in the death penalty area who have witnessed their clients, and I've had other clients reform themselves completely. The impact that that's had on so many other prisoners and people observing is an extremely positive impact. So just as brutality harms the victim of brutality and it brutalizes the person who does the action, and the ripple effect is to brutalize society itself, just as that is real, so too reformation improves the person who reforms, improves the people around them, and improves the whole of society. So these are kind of fundamental choices. Do you choose brutality as a way to administer justice? Do you choose the option for reformation as a way to administer justice and improve society? To me, it's pretty obvious which one is going to be better for society. And behind those stories and behind those basic principles, you need a jurisprudential framework, of course. But yeah, it's doable, and it's what we should be doing, and it's what happens in many places. What do wins and losses mean in death penalty? Well, I guess for sure, if your client is executed, that's a loss. Although, strange as it may seem, the wins that we see and the wins that we've been involved in, no one remembers them, no one cares about them. So their impact on society is effectively zero, close to zero. The losses that we've had have had an enormous impact for the good in society, because people understand the absurdity of the killing. When a client is reformed, teaching, valuable, contributing member of society, a healthy young man full of muscle, because of course in jail all the young men train and do all their exercise, to then say, oh, you lose, you're dead. To me, it's frankly and obviously absurd to do that. And society sees that absurdity when they understand the Reformation and the contribution of that person, and then the consequence is, now you're dead. We're just going to kill you. At a certain time, on a certain day, we're going to kill you. Now that's a loss, because our clients are dead. But out of that destructive, self-defeating absurdity, society learns precisely that, and surely we can do better, and society improves its understanding from those losses.